Hey, boys and girls, this book is called Leprechaun on the Loose by Marcia Thornton Jones. Leprechaun on the Loose. A leprechaun was loose in the classroom, and Cydney was the only one that knew it. Cydney saw teeny tiny green footprints on the floor. He followed them to the table where Miss Yoder had cupcakes for their St. Patrick's Day party. Cydney peeked inside the box. All the green icing had been licked off the cupcakes. Cydney set out to find that leprechaun. It was plain bad luck when he stepped on his own shoelace. Oof! Whoosh! Splat! Cydney fell right on the table. Cydney ruined our party snack, Della Puddington told everyone when Miss Yoder threw away the squished box. I didn't do it, Cydney said. It was the leprechaun. An itty-bitty hee-hee-hee came from behind the fish tank. But Cydney was the only one who heard it. During reading time, Cydney noticed something was wrong with the fish. He sneaked to the back of the room and looked into the tank. The leprechaun was swimming the backstroke, and the fish definitely were not happy. Cydney dove after the leprechaun. Plop! Kerplunk! Sploosh! Water soaked the table. Cydney ruined our decorations, Della cried when Miss Yoder threw away the soggy paper shamrocks. I didn't do it, Cydney said. It was a leprechaun. And Cydney was sure he heard a tiny little ha 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 as he mopped up the mess. During science class, Cydney heard a creak, creak, creak coming from the hamster's cage. Cydney tiptoed to the cage. He carefully opened the door and came face to face with the leprechaun. While Cydney and the leprechaun stared at each other, the hamster ran out the open door and across the table. Cydney dived after the hamster. Boom! Bam! Crash! Cydney fell against the table. Juice went everywhere, just as the hamster scurried out of sight. Our juice is gone, Della said with a sniffle. So are the decorations and all of our cupcakes. Cydney ruined our St. Patrick's Day party. Cydney was sure he heard a faint tee-hee-hee from behind the stack of reading books. Nobody believed that Cydney didn't do it. There was only one thing for him to do. He had to catch the leprechaun. At recess, Cydney sneaked past his teacher and ran to the art corner. Everything he needed was there. Cydney pounded and snapped and glued. Perfect, he said when he finished his leprechaun trap. Then he hurried into the lunchroom and looked through the lunch trays until he found a teeny tidbit of corned beef. Cydney carefully reached inside his leprechaun trap with the bait. But just then his foot knocked into the back of the trap. Swish, clang, zing! Cydney was caught inside. He heard the tippity-tappity-tippity of itty-bitty boots. I do believe I've caught me a boy, that I have, said the leprechaun with a grin. Let me out, Cydney begged. The tiny little man scratched under his tall green hat. Now why should I be wanting to do a thing like that? Cydney thought fast. Come closer, and I'll tell you a secret, he said. Secret? I love secrets, said the leprechaun as he inched forward. That's when Cydney made his move. He reached out and he tickled the leprechaun right underneath the chin. Ha 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 ha! Hee 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 hee! Ho 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 ho! The leprechaun fell down and hit the trap door. The door flew open. Cydney rolled out and pushed the leprechaun inside. Swing, clang, zing! I've got you, Cydney yelled. Now I can prove that you ruined the party, not me. Party? Said the little man. I'll make you a deal. Let me go, and I'll save the party. Then I'll be gone, and you'll never see me again. How can a leprechaun save our party? Cydney asked. With me treasure, of course. Should he keep the leprechaun and prove he didn't ruin everything? Cydney wondered. Or should he let the leprechaun go and save the party for all of his friends? What should he do? Cydney was running out of time. His class was right outside the door. He had to decide. Quick, tell me where your treasure is, Cydney said. He leaned close and the leprechaun whispered in his ear. The class cheered. The class cheered. Even Della Puddington smiled at Cydney. Miss Yoder wasn't mad at him anymore, and even if she didn't quite believe where Cydney got the party supplies, Cydney was finally able to forget all of his trouble the leprechaun had caused. And then Cydney heard something terrible. Excuse me, lad, said a tiny voice from behind Cydney's box of crayons. I'm looking for my brother. Have you seen him anywhere? There's another leprechaun. So, I guess the leprechaun gave him the party supplies that he needed to have his party, and he saved the party. Leprechaun on the Loose. This book was written by Marcia Thornton Jones and illustrated by Cyd Moore. I hope you enjoyed this book.